All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I have a very special guest, the great Jay Dyer. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me back. And I've been following your streams pretty regularly, so I enjoyed the metaphysics talk with Father Deacon.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you just for coming back. I know how busy you are. You got your InfoWars. You crank out more content than anybody. And so I know how busy you are. So I try to ask for your time sparingly, but I always appreciate when you have a free moment to hop on. And in today's topic, go ahead.
One thing I've noticed about what you perceptively tend to notice the areas that really need to be hit. I think you're really good at that because, the topic you chose tonight, it's a recurring problem. It comes up all the time. And so I think you're really perceptive when it comes to seeing kind of the recurring objections and the things that people don't get. So I think that's good you chose this.
Well, I appreciate it. And you were the person that, when I was thinking about this with Father Deacon doing an overview of metaphysics, is one of the most frustrating things as somebody who, dabbles in the world of philosophy and intellectual history is you just speak right past people because they don't know what you're talking about when you start to do your apologetics, when you move, theories of knowledge over to coherency, when you're talking about circularity, when you're talking about foundationalism. And so that's when I reached out to you and just wanted to put a stream together where you just hammer this one specific topic and we just kind of work through philosophy, work through the history of ideas on this problem of circularity, the pursuit for epistemic certainty, and the realization really in the 20th century that this entire enterprise, really since Descartes, has fallen apart.
Right.
And that, anybody arguing against you and still using these old hat schools of thought, it's like, I don't know what you're doing. Like, haven't you read your books? We're in 2022 now. So we can take it wherever you want to go. I thought maybe just to begin our conversation is to talk a little bit about what is foundationalism, because this is going to be central for us to understand why the problem of circularity or infinite regress is such a devastating problem for people who would pertain to the foundationalist school. So take it away wherever you want to get going, and then I'll ask questions and try to lead the conversation. But wherever you want to go, maybe talk about foundationalism and then this quest for certainty and first principles.
So I think that, like you said, modern epistemology tends to date from Descartes, and Descartes is important because his idea was to seek after indubitable certitude. So he wants in his system and his philosophy this reply to potential skepticism, this way to have indubitable certainty by doubting everything he thought he could. And so he's, if you read the meditations, he'll go through these. I think there's 5. I'm going from memory. It's been 15 years since I read meditations, but he'll go through these meditations kind of doing a series of questioning of presuppositions. So in one way, we can appreciate Descartes for doing what philosophy tends to do, which is question presuppositions, right? We go all the way back to Socrates walking around Athens in the Apology, questioning everybody's assumptions. So that's kind of the enterprise of philosophy, is to do that. So I think in varying degrees, perhaps we can always appreciate different philosophers for different insights and in different ways. Maybe not everybody has, maybe not all the philosophers have that many great things to say, but at least most of the known philosophers have some point that we can appreciate. And so on one level, we can understand and appreciate Descartes' desire to not be duped, to not be deceived by the information of his senses, and to try to question as far down as he could. Of course, I don't believe ultimately that, and I think most philosophers even since Kant, have critiqued his approach to strong foundationalism as being basically a failed attempt. It doesn't work. But we can appreciate the attempt and the enterprise and the desire here. And so the reason that we go to Descartes is because he's kind of the first figure to raise these questions and posit what would be called strong foundationalism. So strong foundationalism wants to ground knowledge in the indubitable, the highest possible degree of certitude, such that it could not be doubted. Mm-hmm. And so his approach then seeks to whittle down, right? And we also have to kind of understand a little bit of the ancient and medieval metaphysic and epistemology, because the ancient and medieval world did do a kind of epistemology. They did do, propositional logic with Aristotle. They did do epistemic types of questions in the Middle Ages. You have the hooded man paradox and these kinds of questions that related to epistemology. But much of the ancient and medieval world didn't ask the modern world's epistemic questions. And the reason they didn't is because there were assumptions that had not yet really been asked or probed. And so they would put in their order of philosophy, you could say, metaphysics first. We do metaphysics, and anything that might pertain to epistemology comes down the road. So it's a secondary kind of question. And if you guys saw the debate with Trent, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight will pertain to and came up in that debate. And so the approach that I had was to ask and raise these more modern questions to people that typically don't know those questions or have sufficient answers to those questions. Because what happens is that when Descartes starts to ask these questions, philosophy will go in the domain of kind of setting metaphysics aside.
Right.
And not to say that necessarily there's no metaphysics or we don't know it, but that, hey, wait a minute, we're going to have to answer these epistemic questions before we can claim to know the metaphysical stuff, right? Because the epistemic questions are prior.
Right.
And in many ways, this is kind of a revolutionary question and approach. A lot of people in the ancient medieval world had not really thought in that way. There's inklings of it. There are transcendental arguments in Aristotle and John Damascus and so forth, but there hadn't really been a questioning at the level of the discipline of epistemology to the degree that Descartes and people after him will begin to do. Right. And so one thing that we should distinguish from the outset that a lot of people have a misunderstanding over, and of course, everybody misunderstands terminology a lot, but when we speak of having a foundational belief, okay, that's not the same thing as foundationalism. Right. Just like having empirical sense data is not the same thing as empiricism.
Right.
And even in the Trent debate, he misunderstood terms and he confused them with schools of thought.
Yep.
So when I said Thomas Aquinas was an empiricist in his approach to sense data, he assumed that I was saying that Thomas Aquinas was a Humean empiricist, as if he was, which is, I was like, no, there's a difference between believing that your starting point is sense data and being a Humean empiricist, right? So not every school of thought is identical to, just like transcendental arguments aren't identical to Kant.
Right. Phenomenalism is not the same thing as phenomenology.
Yeah. Discussing, for example, objects in the realm of ideas is not idealism. If I make an argument on the basis of abstract ideas, doesn't mean that I'm idealist, right, like Plato or somebody. Okay. So we have to be very careful. And so the reason I say that is that depending on which philosophical view or worldview that we have, what we mean by a starting point or a foundational belief could be anything. And I might believe that everything is a foundational belief. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, but somebody might say that if they're a coherence theorist, for example.
Right.
So the words foundational beliefs or starting points don't necessarily equate to foundationalism. Or think about in the debate when I was using arguments about reasoning or logic, and Trent equated that with natural theology. So in his mind, natural theology is the same as making an argument. Like, no, that's not the same thing, right? Natural theology is connected to this idea in your system, the way it's defined, of strong foundationalism. And thank God that in the debate, Trent himself actually went on to define his epistemology in a strong foundationalist way. He even used Descartes' cogito as a valid argument, he thought. So anyway, so foundationalism in the Cartesian sense, strong foundationalism, is an attempt to basically say that all of our beliefs rest on not an infinite regress, but some basic starting point. Sometimes the term is doxastic basicality, meaning that there's no other more basic belief that you could go to or other belief that you would reference to justify that basic starting point.
Right.
In the course of Descartes' philosophy, as you guys know, what he does is he says, all right, well, as I whittle this down to questioning my assumptions, the most basic thing that I can't question is that I have my own existence, right? I think, therefore I exist, or I am, or it's formulated in different ways. And the critiques of that, of course, I think are pretty easy to do, but both Kant in his day and later Bertrand Russell, I mean, there's been centuries of people really kind of devastating and doing devastating critiques of Descartes' cogito as an argument proving or demonstrating a strong foundationalist epistemology. So part of this too is the idea that in order to justify a position or what it is to have true knowledge, if you're a strong foundationalist, means then that true knowledge, properly speaking, is identical to a chain of reasoning that is inferential from the properly basic starting points or the self-evident maxims or the axioms or whatever you want to say. And they have to kind of be brought to mind. I mean, this is for you to be justified in your belief. And they have to basically build on an inference chain from that properly basic belief. Otherwise, the beliefs aren't justified. And so the problem, as you can begin to see with a strong foundationalist approach, is that that's a really tall order. I mean, do we really want to say that all of our beliefs have to immediately be present in our mind in an inferential chain of propositions referring back to or connected to necessarily that properly basic belief? I mean, this is kind of a ridiculous thing when you start to think about it. And before I move on, I do want to mention, so a couple classic critiques, for example, of Descartes' cogito and why it doesn't actually work would be, this has come up in multiple debates, came up with Trent, that came up with basically every debate I've had with an atheist or a Muslim or a Roman Catholic ends up on this point, because they all share, whether it's T-Dump or whether it's Stefan Molyneux or whether it's Azrar Rashid or whether it was Trent Horn, everybody has in their natural theology, the same strong foundationalist approach. And so it's just based on a bunch of really naive assumptions of a basic empiricism, that there's a basic imprinting of sense data, that there's the myth of the given, which we'll get to in a moment,
right.
That there's a privileged epistemic position that they have. I mean, all of these things are just assumed, and it's in many ways, and this is not meant as a pejorative, but it's a very naive position,
right?
Meaning that it has a whole lot of assumptions that are arbitrary and they don't want you to question them. So, for example, in Descartes' cogito, we'll use that as a case study of a bad, strong foundationalist argument. Descartes' claim, I think, therefore I exist. He thought that there's not really any other way to go lower in doubting. There's nothing else I can doubt. That it just seems to be self-evident, right? And the first critique that I think is the strongest critique would be from later philosophers who point out that it's actually a non sequitur. So the fact that that thinking exists or that thinking is occurring does not grant you a metaphysical claim of existence, right, or knowledge of the self.
Right.
In other words, what is the I that's there in that first part of the sentence, right, that leads to the conclusion that there's a metaphysically existing thing, right?
Right.
So it's a non sequitur is the sort of the immediate classic critique. Kant has a really strong critique that when you say, I think, therefore I exist, you're making a statement about what is occurring. An occurrence is relates to time determination.
Right.
Occurring is a time determinate proposition or claim. And Descartes' doubting has not yet said anything about time, right, and space, which are heavily debated philosophy topics between Kant, Newton, different people, right?
Right.
Radically different philosophies of time. So time is part of one's metaphysic. And again, we see that Descartes didn't think to question the metaphysics of time or what it means for a thing to occur.
Right.
So Kant has this really devastating critique to just point out that, are you really doubting everything? Because like you haven't doubted time and time determination, right?
Well, and Kant also critiques him in regards to he's a thinking substance. So he's still evoking these first principle categories of foundationalism from Aristotle, yet he's claiming that he's going to do away with these things. What can I not doubt? Yet at the same time, by saying that I think, therefore I am, and then res cogitans, that he's a thinking thing. Well, you're now invoking soul substance concepts that are metaphysical a priori. Now, again, we are not Kantians, but Kant's critique dealing with, and this is where we're going to move into, maybe you can highlight a little bit of why Descartes in this rationalist and the empiricism that's going to come from Locke, how these are breaking from Aristotle. And then move into Hume and induction, and why, because now we're going to be questioning causality and identity through space and time. Again, these metaphysical categories, if we're really going to question everything, let's question everything. That's what Hume.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So, and many, as I said, there's many other critiques that are important too. For example, a lot of people, especially, for example, the sort of classically minded people that are Thomists or whoever, a lot of those guys are not aware of linguistic philosophy. And in the last 3 centuries, especially since Giambattista Vico is kind of the first figure to really begin to question linguistic assumptions.
Right.
And in the progress of Western philosophy, this really comes to the forefront with Wittgenstein, where you have people really just kind of going crazy into pointing out, all of these assumptions that go into language and meaning and predication. And so it's just a fact of people's ignorance that they would, you have to have no knowledge of linguistic philosophy at all and its questions to think that Descartes' cogito is a self-evident maxim. What's so obvious here that he hasn't questioned? Language.
Exactly.
Right. So a whole other level of critique in the next few centuries will come along with the linguistic philosophers to question at another level and say, hey, wait a minute. Even if we question these metaphysical claims and the epistemic claim in the cogito, what about sentences, man? To say this, to claim that this is the case, already is assuming that sentences and words have meaning.
Right.
Of course, Descartes this is an example of something that, people didn't question that yet.
And he
right?
represents this domino effect of this critical philosophy, this critical analysis. Then somehow we're going to get to more and more precise or certainty through this critical analysis. And so he's the first domino that really drops in regard to this tradition. But eventually, as you said, it's going to just continue to be more and more and more and more critical until it becomes totally circular. And that's where we're going to end.
Yeah, so let's mention briefly, as you said, Aristotle. And in the Russ Mannion paper, which I highly recommend, it's called Contingency of Knowledge, which Father Deacon and I have done. We did a talk on this paper. I think I did a talk, or he did. I don't remember who. Part 1 or 2 or something. But I'll just read a little bit of the section of Mannion where he says, Aristotle had already pointed out long ago that our option regarding first truths, and what he means by first truths is things like the self-evident maxims, the first principles, the doxastic basicality that we're starting with in philosophy. He says we are limited in these. When in regard to Aristotle, when asked to justify why we ultimately believe something, we will either have to give an answer or we will not. If we do not give an answer, then our belief is arbitrary and fideistic. If we give an answer, then our answer will make reference to other beliefs, some other belief or beliefs that we will then be asked to justify those beliefs on the basis of, and so on and so on. In the course of justifying our beliefs, we then refer back to some belief that we have already been asked to justify. Then we will be involved in circular reasoning. If, however, we never refer back to a belief that we have already been asked to justify, then we will be involved in an infinite regress. Right. So none of these actions are actually satisfactory, and a fideistic belief is, by definition, unjustified and does not differ epistemologically from its antithesis. This is a very important argument in this whole discussion, because if we are allowed to be kind of arbitrary, even in our first principles, the argument that Mannion is making here is that I can be just as arbitrary, and it's just as valid to propose the antithesis.
Right.
So if your doxastically basic, properly basic starting point is P, and you say, well, we've all got to believe P, right? I mean, P is just the case, and you can't really question that. It's not something we justify. It's just properly basic. There's no reason why I can't come to you and say, okay, but then not P. Not P is equally as valid as P.
Right.
Right. So that's the point Mannion is pointing out back to Aristotle, is that first truths are limited, even Aristotle recognized, and thus have to either be an infinite regress or circular. And in fact, if you recall the Trent debate, Trent actually did both of those things in different periods in the debate. At one point with the cogito, it was self-evident. And at another point, he would refer to other propositions to justify the initial proposition. And so it can go either way, and either way is a problem. And that's the root of the issue that we're going to highlight with tonight's discussion, which is about circularity, which is that ultimately at a meta level, circularity will be unavoidable. Right now, that's what we want to demonstrate by the end of this talk.
And that's where philosophy...
We're not ready to get there yet.
Yeah, philosophy comes to that conclusion. So as we walk through this, we're literally helping the audience move through really the intellectual history from, Descartes to the 20th century, where all this stuff gets hashed out.
So you're right to move then to... So what the reason I brought up Aristotle, though, is to point out that from Aristotle basically up then to Descartes, you kind of have the same basic approach to foundational beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that's why we can classify people like Aquinas, right? Medieval scholastics. They're pretty much in this same tradition. They're not really going to differ from, especially, with the influence of Aristotle and Aquinas, he's going to agree with things like the peripatetic axiom, that there's nothing in the intellect that isn't first in sense data. So it's not an empiricist in the sense of David Hume, but it's an empirical theology that Aristotle has. Yes. And we're beginning by as you mentioned with Descartes, to have some questions that go at a deeper level here. Hey, wait a minute. Maybe we've actually not had good basis for some of these beliefs if everything starts from sense data. So what Descartes wants to do is ground the knowledge in something more certain or indubitable,
right,
beyond sense data. So he's looking for the strongest possible certitude that he can find. Now, again, as we saw, he doesn't achieve it. And so when we move to the empiricist philosophers, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, we have the next phase of this, like you said, domino effect. Sometimes it's described as a conversation. And so a lot of people who are new to philosophy or rookies or sophomoric, they'll pick out a period and be like, oh, I like David Hume. He had all the answers. Oh, I like Aristotle. Oh, I like Aquinas a lot. And they just wed themselves to a school. Right. We see this with the Roman Catholics all the time. And they don't realize that this is a millennia, centuries long conversation.
Right.
And so just because you like a guy in the Middle Ages, it doesn't mean he's going to have the best answers to people in the 1800s.
Right.
In fact, they might raise questions that he can't answer.
Exactly.
And that's I think the most difficult thing for a lot of the people that are wedded to certain schools, Aristotelianism, Thomism, right? They have a really hard time with that. And they are afraid, I think, it's my own analysis. I think a lot of them are afraid that if they go in that direction, that system will fall.
Right.
They might think, oh, I end up an atheist or something like that, which is not necessarily the case, but we do have to have intellectual honesty and integrity and, deal with questions as they're posed and not ignore them or call people names because we don't like the difficult questions they ask. So yeah, go ahead.
So continuing right on, this is perfect. Now let's get into the empiricists. We've dealt with Descartes. And so Descartes is criticizing our ability to observe the empirical world and then come up with certain truths regarding that. Now, Aristotle, as you're highlighting, he had his 10 categories, universal categories. So for Aristotle, he's presupposing a priori these 10 categories that he can do induction, he can look at sense data, and then he can deduce from that inductive process back to the universals. Descartes is questioning, can we actually know the validity of our sense data? And then you have the empirical school, which initially is in favor of that, but then with Hume, he questions the whole process of induction. So take us into that empirical school, because Descartes is this rationalistic line that we can really appeal to our own rational ideal, and then we have the empirical that says, no, we really need to ground all this stuff in the sensual world.
Yeah, so essentially what happens is that you have the pendulum swing from one opposite to the other, right? With Descartes, you have the preeminent rationalist who wants the most abstract certitude possible and to ground something in the strongest possible incorrigibility, indubitability. And then in response to this, you have people who come along. Again, Hume is, of course, the classic skeptic who says, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about how we actually know things. As far as Hume thinks, knowledge only comes through the five senses. That's it. There's no other reason or basis to believe in knowledge at all beyond just the sense data that's coming in. And so Hume is an attempt to be supremely consistent with the presupposition of the peripatetic axiom.
Yes.
So notice that Hume's starting point is exactly the same as Aristotle's, exactly the same as Aquinas's. But Hume is saying, guys, Aristotle, Aquinas, you guys have not been consistent. You've told me that the peripatetic axiom is that there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, but then you have violated that by believing in all of these things that you can't show me are actually in sense data. Now, this is where people get tripped up, as you know. They think that we're being Humeans or we're being radical skeptics.
Right.
No, the point is to this is about the issue of justification, ultimately.
Right.
And justifying a belief means giving a good reason for that belief. That's all we're talking about here. I mean, there's more to it. There's justified true belief and then the Gettier problem and all that. But basically speaking, what we're looking for is good reasons for why we believe what we believe. That's what we are looking for when we talk about grounding or justification for a belief. And Hume is just simply saying that it's time to throw out all these metaphysics books, because it may be the case that all the metaphysics are correct, but I want to know how you're epistemically justified in making those claims, those leaps, those beliefs.
Right.
That's the point here.
And on the basis of empiricism, you cannot do that. It's impossible.
Exactly. So if our knowledge is limited to sense data, Hume's saying, I'm going to be consistent with that and call out all of the history of philosophy, which has violated that by importing all of these things that are not actually in sense data. And so the classic example, as you pointed out, is the problem of induction, or causality is also one that's mentioned. And these are just simply to say that induction is that the future will be like the past. It's the process of, for example, science reasoning from the particular to general conclusions.
Right.
And there's an unjustified leap there, because as a finite empirical being, you never have access to this universal state of affairs.
Right.
So you're never justified in going from particular to the universal claim.
Right.
And so you're always stuck in the particular, and then it's always thus a kind of skepticism. And so this is where Hume gets into his arguments about how, you don't actually have a basis to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, because you can't just appeal to the fact that it rose in the past.
Exactly. And we'll see that Bertrand Russell, in the article that you were referencing, he makes this appeal. Well, we can just assume based on past experience that the future has been like the past, but this becomes circular in and of itself. And we'll get to this when we get into the 20th century.
Right. So Hume also raises other important questions, like you said, like that we can't justify belief in things like causality, because when you see event A and event B happening, one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, you're calling that the principle of causation, but there's no actual basis to say that the sense data is actually showing you the principle of causation itself.
Right.
You're just observing event A followed by event B, and you're calling that causation, but that doesn't give you a justification for the universal principle of, quote, causation. And so Hume just kind of does this same move in a lot of different areas, the identity of objects over time, right? I mean, you're saying that I'm the same Jay today as I was when I was a baby, but what's the actual empirical basis to believe that? What's the empirical basis to believe in the past? What's the empirical basis to believe in memory, right? That our memory is accurate or something like so. You could raise a series of questions that are Humean types of questions that lead us to a difficult, boxed in position of radical skepticism on the basis of saying that if our starting point for our system, if our foundation for our belief system is classical foundationalism or empiricism, we're going to be stuck in these dead end boxes, because we may believe all kinds of things that happen to be true, but the problem is that we don't have good reasons to believe them. So this is where you could say from the time of Aristotle to Aquinas or up to Descartes, it's basically a foundationalist model that's at work in almost everybody. Yep. And then from Descartes up on, all of modern philosophy shifts to questions about epistemology. And by the time of the 20th century, epistemology will die. Yeah. Now, I don't believe that it's actually dead. Right. But on these secular approaches, it is dead. It will critique and destroy itself such that it will have no basis for its own claims. And that's where WVO Quine will come into play, because Quine will basically just point out that epistemology really hasn't done anything or moved or advanced since Hume. Right. It's basically been dead since Hume. And, his famous paper basically says that all we're doing now is psychology. We have to really just surrender the discipline of epistemology. So that's the end goal. And that's why we're going to point out eventually, as you said, that argumentation is ultimately in a way circular. And that's why foundationalism is going to be a dead-end enterprise and will not work. And many modern epistemologists concede this, right? It's not just Quine. I mean, the Mannion paper mentions 4 or 5 modern epistemologists, absolutely secular academics who essentially admit that
pragmatism gains its move at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and that really is the philosophical enterprise of America itself. And so that's why we're doing this talk, because for so many people who don't know what you're talking about when we're talking about all this foundationalism, is that the history of philosophy gets to the 20th century, and it's, again, as you're saying, it's focused on epistemology this whole time. Then it says, well, looks like we can't make any single epistemological claims without being circular. And really it opens up then traditional metaphysics in regards to theistic interpretation. So when you do your apologetics, you're actually at the forefront of the philosophical conversation going back to Aristotle. It's just people don't understand this when they're talking to you about it.
Right. So, yeah, and I think we should mention too a couple other kind of attempts of rescue that have been had in the history of philosophy for these positions. I mean, if you have the Bonjour text, which is epistemology that Father Deacon Ananias recommends, the Bonjour text. Not familiar. There's some really good sections where he mentions weak foundationalism. So somebody might say, well, maybe this Cartesian approach is not going to work. But what about something else that's maybe not as tall an order or a higher request to have indubitable certitude? Maybe we can have a weak foundationalism, which doesn't require indubitable certitude, but enters into probabilities. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we don't have to go too deep into this, but the idea that probabilities can function as justifications for beliefs is not going to work, because again, we're going to be confronted with arbitrariness. Because if we start to say that, well, we're justified in believing X if it has 90% probability, I mean, it's just kind of silly, actually, if you think about it. 80%, I mean, it's arbitrary. Like, what percentage? Because when you enter into probabilities, you're bringing in numbers, right? And percentages. Like, there's no clear idea as to what percentage of a belief being probably false or correct tells you that it's justified. It's, again, it just becomes an exercise in arbitrariness, which was the original critique that we had of foundationalism. And there's another really important point to add about foundationalism, that the crux of the problem here, and this is not just for this would apply to strong or weak foundationalists, which is that in order to have a starting point of a justified belief, we have to, from the outset, already have a notion of our criteria of justification. But that's the thing that's in question, is what is the criteria of justification? And so there's this just seemingly insurmountable problem that, as Mannion points out, I'll phrase it the way he phrased it because it's really good. He says, We must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification.
Right.
And that circularity is not going to go away when we try to move into these other schools or these other secular approaches. Even coherence theory will have insights about how our beliefs work as more like a web or a network. But even that will actually be another form of foundationalism. I'm talking about secular coherence theory, right? That's another mistake a lot of people make is they hear somebody say that our beliefs have to be coherent or that we have insights from coherence theory. They'll say, oh, well, then you're a secular coherence theorist. And no, there's just as many problems with that as there is with foundationalism.
Right.
So we have to make that clear too. So we'll get to coherence in a minute, but go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just continuing on then chronologically. So we have Hume, and he then really undermines the certainty of knowledge for the empirical school regarding this critique. So if you want to talk about causality, law of identity throughout space and time, these are appeals back to, as we talked about, these 10 categories of Aristotle, which you cannot justify using the empirical method. And so thereby, for Hume, if you can't use the empirical method, you can't believe in them with certainty. Now, maybe they exist, but you can't know it. And so then that leads really to Kant going in conversation with Hume, and he tries to posit, well, all these categories, these 10 foundational first principle categories of Aristotle, they're just in your mind. They're a priori categories. He has 12 that they're through the synthetic experience of your a priori categories and the phenomena, agreeing with Humean understanding that really all we know is phenomena. He's saying, okay, I agree with Hume with the phenomena. I'm anteing up mental categories, a priori categories, and that is the nature of reality. And then he tries to really at the end and working on his metaphysics, he then uses morality as his way to try to get out of this epistemological problem. His critique of pure reason is that when you critique pure reason really it becomes circular, and therefore it must just be these mental categories for understanding.
Yeah, so Kant is the next important figure. I mean, you could say Locke and Berkeley are important too in different ways, but the reason Kant is important is because he's really shaken by Hume's writings. And so he says famously that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. Right. And so in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, Kant points out that he was really kind of going to have to work hard to give an account for and justify doing metaphysics because, I mean, charitably reading Kant, right, he didn't want to give up metaphysics. Right. He wants us to be able to do it. And while, again, we can appreciate the exercise or the desire here, the system is a gigantic failure. Right. Because what Kant ends up doing is, as you said, sort of making everything. The reason Kant's system is called Transcendental Idealism is because essentially everything that he wants to rescue from metaphysics, he just transfers that into the mind.
Yep.
And so it ultimately will end up in a kind of solipsism, because if I can't know the world beyond my sense data, even if I have all these a priori categories that the mind structures, kind of like a good analogy I heard from a professor was that it's like an ice tray. The mind is like the ice tray, and then the information coming into the senses is like the water that's kind of filters into the little, sections. And so the mind is that tray. Information gets put into its proper category by the mind. The problem, of course, is that this still doesn't get us anywhere in knowing about the external world.
Right.
And if we're stuck in our own minds, and if Kant's system is the case, then Kant can't actually know that other minds work that way, because he can't know anything about other minds, right? So it's a difficult system because of the fact that it's still an autonomous man system building project, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah.
And all of the philosophers basically are secular Promethean system building projects. That's why they all fail. It doesn't mean they don't have insights, but the ultimate goal that they're trying to do, I will build the system that will, like, what's this joke that was going around in 2016, right? Trump will complete the system of German idealism, right? I mean, it was a joke about Trump, but it was expressing the idea of the German idealists to create the perfectly rational grand system, which is just ridiculous. It's stupid, right? Doesn't mean there's not insights. I mean, even in Hegel, for example, there's a lot of transcendental kind of argumentation. Doesn't mean he's a transcendental proponent of God. He's not arguing for the transcendental argument for God, but he will use transcendental arguments in a lot of the places in his system. In the phenomenology of spirit, for example. But
so maybe it's useful then to point out right there that the Renaissance and this humanism. So as we're talking about, what is happening that is focusing on this autonomous system building at a deeper level, and I would argue that you look at the Enlightenment, you look at the humanism, the rise of humanism. The Renaissance. Then you look at the Enlightenment and the focus on reason itself. That there is this philosophical concept that somehow we can just use this pure rationality, and we can come to more and more certitude, when really, as we're talking about, it moves in the opposite process.
Well, again, there's a good writer on the history of culture and philosophy, Louis Dupre, and he has a book called The Hermeneutics of Modernity. And in that book, he points out that Descartes' revolution in terms of epistemology shifts all of the ancient world and medieval world into thinking no longer about metaphysics, but about man's individual mind. So basically, the new starting point is not the metaphysics that's out there or God or whatever. It's now this. And when you start with this and empirical sense data, you have a huge order. You've got a lot to do. And this is why it's so easy to do apologetics in terms of modern atheism and empiricism, is because they've really locked themselves into a stupid system, because they assume that the sufficiency of the human mind to basically do this giant system building project, and it can't even get off the ground because they're not going to be able to answer fundamental questions that I know, for example, as an apologist or student of philosophy, from these philosophers. So if you're going to do this big project, I don't care who you are, whether you're a Dawkins or a Dennett or a whoever, whatever kind of guy you are, atheist philosopher on Reddit or whatever, you're going to have to answer and deal with these problems. And all I have to do is just repeat the questions that these philosophers raise. For example, Kant's system will divorce the mind from the world in itself.
Right.
So what we know is the appearances. We don't know the things in themselves, right? The Ding an sich, the noumena. We know the phenomena.
Right.
And if that's the case, later philosophers build on that to point out that, well, wait a minute, we don't actually know that the information coming into the senses is telling us something about something out there that is accurate.
Right.
Right.
We don't.
That's an assumption.
Right.
I mean, maybe it is, but how do we justify that? In other words, I'll read a quote from philosopher Richard Rorty. Rorty says, since truth is a property of sentences, and since sentences are dependent for their existence upon vocabularies, and since vocabularies are made by human beings, it would seem to follow then that truths are then made by human beings. So while you're sitting here, no, not you, but the person rambling about what they think exists out there in the world, if I know Kant and I know this linguistic philosophy question from Rorty, I can just simply point out that, like, what are you even talking about? You have no justification to know that, number one, the words and the vocabulary sentences that you're saying have meaning, or that they match up to anything that's going on in the external world, because until you solve the dilemmas of Hume and Kant, your mind is divorced from the external world.
Right. Yeah. So continue.
So the point is just that, like, the questions are so insurmountable and difficult when you have these foolish starting points and presuppositions of unbelieving thought, that the systems, I should make it even stronger. It's not that they don't get off the ground. They contradict themselves at such a fundamental level that they make knowledge impossible.
Right. And so, building on what you just said, we have Hume, we have Kant, and then the two schools that really then move forward from there is, empiricism, and really just a larger description is phenomenology, whether it be German idealism or romanticism, American transcendentalism. The new epistemology is now phenomenology. We're going to study the phenomena of sense experience, because really the only thing, if Kant was right for the German ideal, if Kant was right, well, then the only thing we actually know is our sort of conscious reality. And therefore, we can learn the ultimate source of reality. You can look at Hegel's Geist in the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is this grand understanding of history, then moving to this precipice, this ultimate synthesis of the world spirit, of my spirit, Jay's spirit. Jay's the antithesis to my thesis. And so we're working things out through a synthesis, and the whole world is going through this experiential process. And so it's a new understanding of how we come to knowledge. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have the Locke's, the John Stuart Mills of the world, the Auguste Comtes, where they're going to focus more on the hypothetico-deductive model of how we get to truth. And so let's just tackle then those two approaches, because now epistemology, basically after Kant breaks down, we either have the hypothetico-deductive scientific method, or we have the phenomenological method where we just study phenomenal experience. And really my own personal consciousness is the only way that I can extrapolate to universals.
Right. Well, these schools also tend to collapse and not work. And so for example, in phenomenology with Husserl, you have an attempt to engage in these really sort of inane and abstract ways of bracketing one's experience to break them apart and figure out what are the necessary elements of any phenomenal experience. And while you could see that kind of as an extension of some of what Kant talked about, all of these exercises are still kind of futile. I mean, in the case of bracketing and whatnot, later philosophers will ask and raise problems that not only apply to any foundationalist, but would apply to something like the bracketing process. For example, bracketing assumes that I can achieve neutrality, that I can achieve an epistemically privileged position such that I am not influenced by any of my past experience.
Right.
And this is really a philosopher's pipe dream. I mean, how does anybody, I mean, it just assumes brute factuality, right? That what Sellers will call the myth of the given, that objects just have a givenness to them, that and that there's a direct correspondence between the properties of the objects and the sense data that comes into my mind, again, which is an unjustified move. We don't actually know that that's the case. There's a great quote by philosopher Imre Lakatos, pretty well known, but the quote is, "One can today easily demonstrate that there's been no valid derivation of a law of nature from any finite number of facts. Yet we still keep reading about scientific theories being proven from facts. Why is there this stubborn resistance to elementary logic?" And he's just repeating Hume, right? And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about arguments from Descartes or from Locke or all the way up to phenomenologists. Even if we just restrict these things to phenomena of the mind, and we don't care about the external world, again, this leads us to positions of solipsism.
Yep.
If I'm locked in my own mind, then I mean, there's all kinds of things that I don't actually know are the case. And I don't even know what it means to be a mind, or what it means to, when I start to investigate linguistic philosophy, I mean, if meaning is something that's purely human determined, then what good does it say? Is it to say that meaning is a self-referencing structure that my mind has made up? That's what you would have to say. Because again, you don't get information or meaning from the external world that we know of. All we know of is what's imprinted on the mental data that's imprinted from the external world.
Right.
Which again, we don't know that it actually is telling us anything correctly.
Right.
And that will actually be questions that Locke will raise. Locke will raise questions about what are called primary and secondary qualities of objects. And later philosophers simply just collapse these and say, I mean, that's kind of what Kant's doing. I mean, it's like, on what basis do you think that there's an underlying primary substance or essence of a thing if all you have access to is the external phenomenal qualities or properties, or the accidents of a thing, to use Aristotle's term?
Right.
In other words, the belief in the cutting off of metaphysics that Hume and Kant do is very devastating. And it's like it takes centuries for people really to figure out how devastating it is. That's why Lakatos can say centuries later that we still are not answering Hume's problems. And there's another famous paper that I always get mixed up with Quine. It's Nelson Goodman's New Riddle of Induction. And in that famous philosophy paper, and Goodman points out that we still haven't answered Hume. I mean, the problem of induction is still there. That's what Lakatos is pointing out, which is that we don't have actually a valid basis on empirical starting points to believe in laws of anything. So if we don't have laws of nature, how are we going to do science? So Husserl, for example, one of the things he set out to do in the logical investigations was to try to rescue science. He wanted to rescue the logic and math assumed in science. And again, as presuppositionalists, we can actually appreciate this.
Right.
Because one thing that Husserl does is kind of, as a mathematician, he goes through and he looks at how science operates, and he's like, these scientists don't even see how much math and logic they're assuming to do the scientific method.
Right.
Now, that doesn't make Husserl a presuppositionalist, right? But the logical investigations is just a very boring technical 2-volume work demonstrating that over and over and over, really just demolishing this scientism, this positivism, and this pragmatism that you're talking about.
Right.
And so he again attempts to kind of resurrect some of these ancient medieval and metaphysical ideas from his mentor, Franz Brentano. Brentano, for example, wanted to resurrect this idea of the medieval philosophers of intentionality, yes, that we direct in the process of knowing, we direct our intention to some intentional object, and then that leads to the phenomenal experiences. Right. And then we can dissect the phenomena of experience by breaking it down into the different aspects of that phenomena. Right. So now these attempts, which again, they're interesting in that they have some insights and that they point out things that you might not know about or are there in an object. For example, this kind of brings up the question of what's called mereology, mereology. And many of the phenomenologists had some pretty fascinating insights into the question of parts and wholes when it comes to objects. So I'm just giving this as an example of why not everything in these schools of philosophy is bad or stupid. They have some insights, just like Kant, right? Like when I look at an object, for example, there's a horizon to that object. And what that means is that anytime I'm looking at a book, for example, I can't immediately see the other side of the object. And even if I turn it around to see that side, I still can't see the side that I just turned around. And human philosophy of perception is always limited in this way. And so this is another insight that they have about the limitation of sense data that previous philosophers may not have picked up on or focused on. Because again, remember, if we're going to be consistent with David Hume, if I'm limited by my sense data, wait a minute, there's actually a whole bunch of things I'm not immediately sensing. So the question the bar gets raised even higher. Wait a minute. And when we say that we only are justified in believing our immediate sense data or what we can prove from sense data, that's a tall order. Like, I'm not perceiving China. I'm not perceiving the other side of my hometown. I'm not perceiving the other room. You see how limiting this is. Right. So again, philosophy is just in this constant process of conversation of dissecting and refuting the generation before, or the schools the generation before. Right. So I mean, I don't mean to ramble about this, but all of that was just to point out that more and more sophisticated questions and insights get raised as philosophy progresses and as these schools form and develop, and nothing gets done. That's the point, or nothing actually gets solved, because in all of these secular philosophical schools, which may have insights, as Lakatos says, they never are able to answer the more fundamental challenges and questions that Hume raised.
Right. So continuing and just ending this line into the 20th century, then the student of Husserl is Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. And so he develops his phenomenology, being in time. And so the new universal, because we can't extrapolate due to the Kantian critique, due to the limits of empiricism, the new one is just being itself. That is the universal. And so this is the new foundation then within the phenomenological enterprise. That leads into, so he has a book called Being in Time, then Sartre's book, Being in Nothingness. that this whole phenomenological universality of knowledge and epistemology leads to actually there's nothing there. I am. So then Sartre almost blends together the phenomenology and the phenomenal sense data, that all I am is really back to like a John Stuart Mill, where there is no self. What I am is I'm being imprinted on by sense data, and what I consider a mind is just I can reflect on sense data. So I had an idea, yesterday, and so I can think. That is the process of thinking, is reflecting on sense data. And so for Sartre, then his existentialist phenomenological enterprise is you make yourself in the world through will and all this different stuff. Again, circular, foundationally circular, and that's why then it leads to no objective truth. There is no objective truth in a Sartre. Heidegger.
This is where philosophers begin to basically just dispense with the older requirements.
Yeah.
They say, we're done. I mean, there's just no answer to these questions. And so the move from these really highbrow continental philosophers and their attempts to save metaphysics with Heidegger and whatnot, again, not to say that there won't be insights in those philosophers, but that the projects end up failing. I think in Husserl's case, he ended up going off into something basically Buddhist, right? Which is, so he kind of just gave up, right. And adopted these incoherent philosophies of more or less Buddhism. I mean, I don't even I try to read the later Husserl, and I don't even know what he's saying. It's almost undecipherable.
Yeah. No,
and I think Heidegger saw a lot of these problems in Husserl, and he critiques Husserl and basically tries to come up with these kinds of, like you said, these concrete universal principles like being that we can latch onto. But of course, as we know as presuppositionalism, there's no raw, uninterpreted idea of what being is. I mean, what does that even mean?
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it just assumes again, and it's another attempt at human system building that is trying to not answer kind of fundamental questions again that have been raised since Hume. So we can appreciate at least, Husserl's attempt to want to go back to metaphysics, to want to reinvigorate some of these disciplines that had seemed to be dead or whatever.
Right.
But whether these projects are successful is another issue, and I don't think that they are, because I don't think any autonomous man-based system or approach is going to work. It's not going to be able to solve these issues, because all they can ever refer back to is the man who invents or creates that system.
Exactly.
And it's always going to be a limited human finite system that is not going to be able to answer these fundamental, Humean problems of induction. And if by the way, there's no induction, then also deduction fails. Right. Mannion has a good critique of that. So all of these problems that Hume raises then basically destroys the process of justifying beliefs in epistemology. And that's why the Quine paper is so important, because epistemology in the 20th century gets naturalized. And by that, it means it just turns into psychology.
Right.
So basically, there's not any clear, he's arguing, distinction between analytic and synthetic truth. This breaks down. If we're empiricists, the problems are the same since Hume. And so it's time to really just surrender the discipline of epistemology and give up on it. And so many people don't realize that when you do that, then the schools that you're talking about are the logical conclusion of postmodernism, existentialism. So those systems no longer care about
at all
the questions of justification. We don't care about that, man. Those are dumb, spurgy questions of people in the ancient medieval world, and the Enlightenment philosophers, and we don't care about that anymore. Now what we're going to do is, and then it basically becomes each sort of philosopher kind of inventing his own little school of groupies about his cool idea, right? Like mine is and this is where Wittgenstein is insightful, because he basically says philosophy is just a bunch of weirdos doing therapy.
Right. No, you can appreciate Wittgenstein, and that's where I want to go next, because at least he gets elevated as like a logical positive prodigy with his Tractatus, and then he's like, I don't know, I'm not so sure about it. By the later Wittgenstein, he's basically undermined the entire logical positivist school that he was lifted up to be the prodigy of. And so I want you then flipping over to the other side of this post-Kantian, post-Humean stream is empiricism. So we go from Locke and Hume into people like John Stuart Mill. And then from there, we get this focus on the hypothetico-deductive model of epistemology, which leads into the Venetian school of logical positivism. And so dive into this logical positivist. Okay, so they're going to what they believe to do is accept Hume's critique. They're going to accept Kant's critique, and they're going to come up with a better way to understand reality. And this is where we start to get into this philosophy of language. So can you speak now into logical positivism and how that connects with empiricism and brings us into the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, it again is another attempt to draw out a lot of really silly starting points that end up basically being very arbitrary. So I think I have an essay I wrote many years ago. It's kind of fuzzy, but I went into Rudolf Carnap and some of these guys that come out of that tradition, and what the Vienna school tries to do is, like you said, somebody like Bertrand Russell would be another person that would be representative of this kind of system to where they think that they can basically create a fully encapsulated system of logic or mathematics that would, in a kind of a one-to-one correspondence way, match up to reality. So they come up with these correspondence theories of truth, correspondence theories of language that, the linguistic philosophy is not a problem because the word bat just is a one-to-one correspondence to that thing over there. And so it's all these really just low IQ, low tier, like it's almost like a commonsensical type of approach at the same time as trying to have these really elaborate, Russell thinks that he can create a perfect math set theory that will explain all of reality.
Yeah, an ideal language that if you spoke it correctly, it would accurately map onto reality itself. So this mind phenomena separation, he's trying to bring it back with the use of language and mapping language logically onto the phenomena, because he's not making a case for soul substance. He's not making a case for universals. He's just making a case for what's the best way that we can know the world, referring back to mathematics.
And this is where Wittgenstein is helpful and actually funny, because he eventually starts asking questions, as you said, about language. And he's known probably most famously for the idea of language games, that language doesn't actually operate the way these people think.
Right.
And if you're going to do symbolic language structures or systems that are supposed to represent meaning or numbers or math or logic, then you're going to have to give an account for how words mean and how symbols mean. And this is where semiotics starts to come into play and become really important. The philosophy of signs and symbols, and Charles Sanders Peirce and Saussure, these different characters, and they matter because they really dig into this issue of symbols and reference, sign reference, and so
semiotics.
Forth. And so, Wittgenstein basically points out that, look, there's not really any way to make sense of language and linguistic philosophy without assuming language and linguistic philosophy. And so even though he's basically coming to the realization of the circularity in words and meaning, and he's basically just calling it a game, it's very insightful for us because it's going to give us good insights into how systems like Russell's ideas and whatnot don't actually work and do what they think it does.
Right.
And so, Wittgenstein has this idea where he, makes all these arguments, and then at the end of the book, he's basically saying that, by the way, we don't actually know that words mean. So, but he's written a whole book saying that it's word games.
Right.
Did you see how that would be self-refuting? Right.
Yeah.
Like I wrote a whole book, but by the way, my book is a joke and it's just word games and it doesn't actually mean and it doesn't prove anything. And this gets us Post-Modernism and Deconstructionism. This is where the deconstructionists, the Derridas, come along and they say, well, nobody can actually know the author's intent. And if we can't know the author's intent, then really meaning is a social construct. Meaning is imposed on the text based on power relations and oppressor oppressed narratives. And that's where that goes off into Frankfurt School stuff, right? So really, again, the point of all this is just to point out that philosophy once again comes back to this dead end. The logical positivist stuff falls apart. People eventually just discard that kind of stuff because it just gets devastated and critiqued by so many philosophers.
And so regarding some of these critiques, so logical positivism brings us into the early 20th century. And again, it's this emphasis on logic and mathematics. If we can map this ideal language, then we can map language directly onto reality.
And that will create this kind of perfect total system.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this whole system, this logical positivism, is based on, again, this hypothetical deductive model, the empirical verifiability principle. And so then with people like Quine then raise, can you empirically show me the empirical verifiability principle? And this is where then the whole tradition starts to fall apart, this logical, because this is the circularity that everybody begins to realize in the 20th century, is that, wait, this whole logical positivism, you just assumed your principle of justification that can't be justified based on your own principle of justification.
Yeah, Father Deacon has a really good paper critiquing Quine's naturalized epistemology and showing and kind of making arguments along those lines. I think it's called Naturalized Epistemology. That PDF is in the Discord if anybody's interested. It's a really good paper from Father Deacon, and he's making your point there that the surrendering of justification and epistemology comes at a heavy price, and for the atheist, for the unbelieving secular type of person, for the positivist, for the materialist, et cetera, if they have that kind of an approach, if you go that route, you can't debate. Right. Debate is done.
Right.
In other words, you don't actually have any arguments against Christianity. I mean, you might not like it, you might not believe it,
right?
But you don't have arguments against it,
right?
Because now there's no such thing as argumentation. If there's no argumentation, then there's no debate, there's no logic, there's no reasons to believe or not to believe. So they don't, most of the time, philosophers are not consistent with the positions that they're adopting. And of course, the job of the apologist is to call those people to consistency. Hey, wait a minute, you said this, and then you're saying this. You got to be consistent with these two things, man. If you don't believe in epistemology anymore, if you're surrendering it, like Quine points out, then that comes at a heavy cost, and you can't do debate anymore.
Yep. Yeah. So...
And by the way, I went on that point of creating a kind of a perfect one-to-one correspondence math system. Yeah. I think you had mentioned, Gödel. This is where Gödel comes in contra as an insight, contra Russell, because Gödel points out that from math itself, you can show that there's no complete set. The set will always appeal outside of the set to something extra set.
Well, speak to that. Explain Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And
right, and it's in response to that set building approach that you mentioned from
the Vienna School.
From the Vienna School, from Russell and these people, and he's pointing out. And by the way, there's I can't find these quotes anymore, but somebody had dug up some obscure quotes from Gödel, pointing out that the Vienna School and people like Russell were actually part of a conspiracy.
Oh, really?
And he calls it a global conspiracy to not just destroy knowledge and philosophy, but he had apparently become aware of their plan for mass depop, right? Because we know Russell.
Oh, I didn't know about this.
Yeah, this is. Really I've never been able to find it again. It was some guys from a philosophy department that had found these old archives and papers from Gödel.
That would be really nice to have, yeah.
And Husserl too. Husserl had mentioned the same, that he was on to this conspiracy. So some of these guys had noticed this and they couldn't believe it. And some people point out that Gödel towards the end of his life got really paranoid and was scared. And he thought, because he had kind of realized that what these Royal Society goons were up to, like that they might come after him. So I wish I could find those quotes. I'll never be able to find them again. They were on some philosophy blog from 10 years ago. I mean, they look legitimate quotes. They weren't just like made up nonsense. This was from actual professors. So anyway, but the point is that Gödel had this insight, being a mathematician, that Russell is wrong on the way sets work, right, and that they become self-referencing. And so some people misunderstand me talking about this. They think that I'm saying that Gödel was making a transcendental argument for God's existence. No, he wasn't doing that. But what he was showing was that the way mathematics and logical systems work is that they will appeal outside of themselves, right. and thus there cannot be any self-contained, perfectly consistent set, system, or theory. Another philosopher, sort of savant character, Douglas Hofstadter, wrote a famous Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, and he shows that in both Gödel's theorems and in the art of MC Escher and in the music of Bach, for example, you have the same, what he calls strange loops. And strange loops are, again, not just features of math and set theory, they're features of artworks. And so the repeating patterns that you see in Escher's famous works, repeating structures. I'm not a music person, so I don't really understand all of this, but the way that Bach's pieces can actually kind of be a never-ending loop. They're written in a certain way that they demonstrate the same principle of the strange loop, as he calls it. And the point is that it's just further demonstrating and proving Gödel's point that not just in math, but in many areas of life in the arts, we actually see this principle of self-referential strange loop.
Right.
I don't know what else to call it. And so that's an analogy to how I would understand circularity working, yes. Right? Again, think back to the Wittgenstein analogy. How are you going to, how do we know that words mean, right? I mean, surely that's a valid question. I mean, nobody can say, although some philosophers do, they're like, you can't ask that question, right?
Right.
They'll be arbitrary, like, you can't ask that question. Okay, well, why can't I, right? Well, usually people don't want you to ask the questions that they can't answer. So exactly. So if we ask this kind of meta level question, how do we know that words mean without using words, right? We can't, we're stuck.
Right.
We're not going to be able to give an account of words or explain words without using words, right? So the astute, annoying philosopher man might say, hey, wait a minute, as you're explaining words, you're using words, you're using the thing in question. It's a circular argument. And the point is that when we come to, and we could ask the same type of question about logic. We could say, how do we know logic is logical? That's a meta level question. That's a metalogical question. That's why there are metaphysical questions. There are meta ethical questions, right? How do we know that ethical norms are ethical? How do we, and there's nothing inherently wrong or false or stupid about these kinds of questions. It's not word salad. They're valid philosophical questions and disciplines. People write books about metalogic, metaethics.
Right.
A lot of ignorant people say, you're just making it up. It's word salad. It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. I'm sitting here reading a book right now on epistemology, and the guy's talking about meta level questions, right? And I recommend, by the way, if you're looking for a good, now he's not orthodox, but he's a evangelical professor, I think at Wheaton, W.J. Wood. He has a good book on epistemology from at least a Christian evangelical perspective. Yeah. And the book is good because one thing he points out early on is that modern epistemology, because it's secular, it's actually dispensed with the idea of ethics having anything to do with epistemology. But now, wait a minute. And this is, you've heard me make this argument many times. I mean, people that listen to our material. I mean, if I'm making an argument to you and I'm wanting to persuade you, doesn't it kind of assume that you should follow what's true?
Right.
So how are we going to divorce ethics from the true?
Right.
Right. And thus, by extension, we can ask other questions. How are we going to divorce the true from the good? So we're immediately involved inferentially in the domain of metaphysics, even if we're talking about ethics.
Right.
And so his point is just simply that we've lost this holistic view of the fact that how can we really divorce epistemology from ethics, from the idea of what he calls the intellectual virtues, having integrity, having intellectual integrity, having intellectual honesty, being studious, right? Not being lazy. These are all things that used to be stressed in the domain of academia and being scholastic. I don't mean scholasticism, but being scholastic. Those are good things, right? And if we divorce those things from epistemology, then we start to get into the domain of epistemology turning into the thing that that Wittgenstein is saying, right? Like philosophers are just like crazy people, right? Like, I mean, it's like, or I think maybe I may be wrong about this, but I'm just going from memory. It's been, again, probably 2006 since I had my Nietzsche class, but it seems like Nietzsche said something like, you know, philosopher along the same lines as Wittgenstein. He says philosophers are like lawyers. Like they don't even really necessarily believe it. They're just arguing some case to convince you. And they don't even care if it's true, or who knows if they even believe it. It's just a bunch of lawyering. So, I mean, you see that if we divorce ethics and the true and the good from epistemology, then we get these kinds of dilemmas where it's not about what's true anymore. And so we didn't really get into coherence theory tonight, but
I wanted to just quickly shift gears and just hit on a few topics real quick in regards to, you talk about Kuhn and the scientific revolution, talk about webs of belief, paradigms. This is all happening right around the same time that we have Gödel, that we have Quine's criticisms. And so then just mention Kuhn, and if you want Popper and maybe his criticism, and then lay out, if we have time, get into coherency real quick. I know you're short on time. You got things you got to do, and I think you got another stream. But
yeah, so maybe let me read this as a summary, because it's worded really, really well. It might take a few minutes, but it's worth it, because if you guys remember back to, you know, some of the topics that came up in the Trent debate, and then I later shared you know, a couple pages from this book, because he words it really well, and this will get us to coherence, and then we'll look a little bit into the insights of coherence theory and webs of beliefs, but why we're not necessarily going to say, oh, I adopt wholesale some secular epistemic theory of coherence. It's just insights that we got.
Exactly.
So in his book on epistemology, W.J. Wood points out about the problems in foundationalism. He says, being grounded in beliefs that are epistemically basic are described as kind of a starting point for strong foundationalists. Critics ask, however, should we think that only beliefs that are self-evident or indubitable or evident to the senses are properly basic? In other words, on what is the prior criteria by which we are saying this, and this are properly basic? Doesn't that kind of make the prior criteria more basic than the properly basic? And that will be the problem, you see, right? He says, true, any belief meeting one or more of these standards is an ideal candidate for proper basicality. But is it necessary that a basic belief meet these standards? Should this list of criteria be considered exhaustive? These criteria alone appear much too restrictive, for they fail to encompass many beliefs that we as humans have and hold without the benefit of argumentative support. Consider, for example, beliefs in one's senses, memory, consciousness. None of these beliefs are necessarily self-evident or indubitable or evident to the senses, and yet everybody, I think we would agree, has proper warrant or belief or that they are properly basic beliefs. In other words, it would seem odd if, I mean, you could go in the route, I guess, of doubting those things, but if we do, we end up in dilemmas of kind of destroying the possibility of knowledge.
Right.
Alvin Plantinga has argued that the criteria offered for identifying genuinely basic beliefs introduce a deeply self-destructive feature into the foundationalist account. If, as a foundationalist claims, only beliefs that are self-evident or indubitable or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic, then it behooves us to ask about the epistemic status of the basic belief itself, that only beliefs that are self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic. Is this belief itself self-evident? Mm-hmm. That's the question that you kind of posed earlier. Yep. And I like the fact that you hit on that, because that's what Dr. Wood is hitting at in his book. And then he notes that strong foundationalism thus accepts a criteria that runs afoul of its own standards.
Right.
Yeah. And so when I brought that up in the Trent debate, you'll notice again that he kind of went circular there and said, well, it's properly basic because it's self-evident, and it's self-evident because it's properly basic. And we know that those are self-evident, properly basic, because they're the ones that are self-evident, properly basic. Right? I mean, that's the point here, is that this doesn't work. And so other problems he goes on to mention that often come up, like the myth of the given. And this is another big, I think I brought it up in the Trent debate. I think I brought it up in the Stefan Molyneux debate, but this is just simply a question about what Sellers calls self-presenting states of one's perceptual consciousness, right? The idea that I seem to see a door, I seem to see red, whose job is to undergird all of our empirical knowledge. The belief that an epistemic regress can be halted in these self-authenticating nonverbal episodes of perceptual consciousness is what Sellers calls the myth of the given. The myth consists in thinking that perceptual states such as this thing is red and our powers of sensory discrimination in general are somehow pure and incorrigible,
right,
completely independent of any theoretical contribution or background beliefs, right, which is just simply to say that our experiences are not theory laden. Really?
Yeah, it's impossible.
How do you demonstrate this? What is the justification for the assumption that our basic beliefs or sense data is not theory laden?
Right.
And for a foundationalist account to work, that has to be the case.
Right.
And so, again, no one in that, there's not going to be a solution in that school to the myth of the given. Now, so when this is usually laid out, then people point out, well, then what's the other options? And there's a couple other options, and ultimately they both fail. But I want to mention a couple other things about what foundationalism typically is tied to, and that's called evidentialism. Oh, and evidentialism is the idea that, well, you kind of back up and demonstrate these beliefs that you have based on your properly basic belief, based on sufficient proof and evidence. And if you guys have heard enough of the debates that we've done, you've noticed how often this is just blown past and assumed, as if we have a clear idea as what, quote, proof is, or what sufficient proof is. And these people never tell you what sufficient proof is. And it also makes, remember the Matt Dillahunty debate, because this came up with the Matt Dillahunty debate. Matt says you should only believe in things that you have sufficient empirical evidence to believe in. And I said, well, Matt, do you have sufficient empirical evidence to believe that?
Really?
And by extension, Matt in the debate admits that he believes in transcendental categories.
Yeah.
I said, Matt, what's the empirical evidence for transcendental categories? He said, there is no evidence. You can't prove those things. They just are. Okay, so Matt, so you don't believe that you have to have good empirical evidence to believe in things that you believe in.
So he's arbitrary in the way that
it is arbitrary, exactly. And so evidentialism is a really, again, naive addendum to the foundationalist approach to the thing, which is it just kind of assumes that evidence and, quote, proof are these vague kind of self-evident. We all know what proof is. We all know what's a sufficient proof. No, we don't. That's what's assumed here. In fact, crackers in the pantry fallacy that Bonson points out, not everything is proven in the same way.
Right.
I mean, is it the case that the way that I go about proving something in math is the same way that I prove something in chemistry? Is it the same way that I prove that I love my wife?
Right.
No, I mean, it's just silly, right? Again, these are really basic, naive assumptions on the part of the people that adopt these schools. And they typically don't, make the connection between the fact that, for example, to say that some beliefs are basic and other beliefs are not basic, properly basic and non-basic, assumes that you already have a prior criteria to sift them out.
Exactly.
But the prior criteria was not included in the properly basic beliefs, but it has to be.
Exactly.
And so they just have all of these arbitrary assumptions that they don't give an account for and can't. And by the way, the arbitrary assumptions then become the other thing that they reference to justify the properly basic beliefs.
Right.
Well, if something is properly basic justified on some other principle, then it's not properly basic. Because in their system, by definition, a properly basic belief does not refer to another belief to find its justification.
Yeah, so back to Aristotle, and
they're stuck in what is that? That's a circle.
That's circularity.
And what is it that the person from our school is trying to point out? Which is that at a certain level, guys, circularity is unavoidable.
Yes, it's inevitable.
That does not mean that we're saying in any and every case you can make circular arguments, right? I'm not denying the fallacy of circularity. But I like to give the example of as we often point out, this is a category mistake. What do I mean by that? You can't reduce meta level questions to non-meta level questions or to basic level questions. So, for example, let's say I have the belief that Lil Wayne lives next door to me, and I've seen a guy coming in and out of the house with dreads, and he looks like Lil Wayne, right? And then people don't believe me. And so, but I'm really firm in this belief, so I'm really probably, I have a 90% probability. I'm pretty sure that's him, man. And then, so it turns out we get a camera crew over here, and we go over there and we knock on the door, and it turns out, oh no, it's somebody else, right? It's Bill Cosby wearing a Lil Wayne, dreadlock head. I don't know. Right. So, but it's not him. So I had a really strong belief I was convinced of. But does being wrong about that destroy the possibility of knowledge in my world? Is my worldview going to collapse if I'm wrong about that?
Nope.
No. But if I say something like, well, I just don't believe that words have meaning. I don't believe that logic is the case. I don't believe that there are any laws of logic. Well, wouldn't you point out that how am I talking? Right. How am I making arguments?
How am I understanding you to even respond? The use of language already presupposes some type of logical consistency.
Right. So to demonstrate the difference between a meta level question and not a meta level question, right? I mean, being wrong about something at a factual level or a non-meta level question doesn't destroy the possibility of knowledge, right? But if there is no such thing as logic, if there is no such thing as words having meaning, then now we've destroyed the possibility of knowledge at all, if that's the case, you see. So in the same way, that's why we point out that something that is a meta level question cannot avoid circularity. And so it's just an unavoidable feature of those level of questions, because those levels of questions become self-referencing. Again, how do we explain words having meaning without using words? It's an impossible thing. But we wouldn't say that because words are ultimately self-referencing that, well, then I guess words have no meaning because words are based on the fallacy of circularity. No, that's ridiculous, right?
Right. So
that's the point of the set theory stuff, which is to demonstrate that things become self-referential at a certain level. But when it comes to debating matters of fact or matters of empirical data, right, these kinds of questions, I can definitely be wrong. I could be proven wrong on the basis of new evidence, right? But that doesn't destroy the possibility of knowledge being wrong about some factual claim like that.
And so all this stuff has led these as the article that you sent me, these autonomous systems, as if Kurt Gödel's right, Kurt Gödel, and his incompleteness, that all these systems inevitably become self-referential. All these autonomous systems, since we've done away with the presupposition of God, we begin with that basic foundational principle of the belief of God, and therefore from there we can get into these metaphysical speculations, categories, empirical understanding. How much does our mind actually understand the phenomenal reality we experience? But if we don't have God, then we are diving into a self-referential system. Something has to appeal outside the system. And so conclude this talk then, because I feel like we've done a really good job bringing all this stuff together. Conclude it with then why the transcendental argument is the necessary precondition for knowledge itself, because every other system of knowledge building outside of a beginning of an a priori appeal to God ultimately is circular by definition, based on its own grounds for knowledge, for justification of knowledge itself. Therefore, it completely undermines the whole process.
Yeah. And
then lead into, so again, this whole coherency thing and the transcendental argument.
So this is where coherence, theory of truth, and epistemology comes into play, because as I was mentioning earlier, with these sort of naive approaches to evidentialism, crude evidentialism literally says that any belief, like riding a bike, requires a chain of conscious propositional. No, I mean, it's that silly, first of all. So in other words, to believe that I'm riding a bike, or that I know how to ride a bike, kind of like it's so silly. Like, it requires me to sit and have this logical chain of beliefs in my conscious mind, Of course, we don't actually operate that way, right? I mean, we know kind of instantaneously once we've learned how to ride the bike. So right. It's totally contrary to actually how humans operate. But and so, there are other philosophers who posit systems like sensible evidentialism, which is a modification of crude evidentialism. And again, those systems are problematic because we can think like classical proponents of these ideas would be people like Locke. For example, Locke says we should proportion our beliefs to what the evidence says. We should only believe what we have sufficient evidence to believe. We should weigh competing experiments and see which have sufficient evidence. I mean, all of these things are so vague that they don't really tell us anything.
Right.
And so the failure of foundationalism and by extension, these crude and naive evidentialisms led philosophers to posit other ideas, perhaps looking at other models that better explain how our beliefs and our thoughts and our worldviews work. So coherence says maybe rather than looking at foundations and kind of like stacking things on top of blocks, right? What if it's more proper to look at our beliefs like webs, where the beliefs kind of all relate and connect to one another. Yep. So my belief about logic is necessarily going to be connected to my belief about ethics, which is necessarily going to be connected to my belief about the external world, which is necessarily going to be connected to my belief about God, if I believe in God, for example. So for a Christian theist or for somebody in our position, we might say that, you could say maybe God is at the center of that web. And then out from that web would be all of the attendant beliefs that we have about the world, all the way down to any possible belief, right? And the point is to show that that is a better model for understanding how our beliefs are theory laden. They're not independent beliefs or the myth of the given problem from Sellers, as if it's just a bunch of independent pieces of data that don't necessarily connect or correlate with one another. And so this is epistemic holism as opposed to the piece by piece empiricist approach, right, to understanding things. Now, that doesn't mean that a coherence theorist doesn't believe in empirical data. But the empirical data that I have, the beliefs that I have, that the tree is over there, the stick is over there, the book is over there, those would be, again, in the web. And they would be necessarily connected to all of my other beliefs and experiences. Like if I come to, for example, I'm studying earthworms in the science lab. Like when I come into the science lab and I put the lab coat on, do I automatically become like divested of all my previous experiences of earthworms? No. I mean, how is that possible? Right. I mean, aren't I going to, as I interpret the earthworm in front of me, be influenced by all the previous books that I've read about earthworms and all the earthworms I've studied in the lab in the years before? Yeah, of course. Right. And isn't my understanding of the earthworm going to be connected to where I believe they come from and the origins of life and everything else in my worldview? Of course. Right. So isn't this kind of just obviously a better model for how humans work and for showing that our interpretation of experiences and objects is theory laden and not brute fact? There's no such thing as brute facts. So these are important points that kind of go along with the holistic epistemology of a coherence theory or a web of beliefs. The beliefs then, as we say, cohere, meaning that they have explanatory power and they are directed towards the true. Right. So there is in the coherence theory an assumption that the person who is striving to have coherence and explanatory power in his worldview, that's directed towards the true. So it's kind of difficult to divorce this, because it's holistic, from the intellectual virtues, from truth, from being truth directed. It's difficult to divorce it from metaphysics, you see, because the true and the good and telos are metaphysical things. We didn't even
get into teleology, yeah. Yep.
But I'm bringing it in because it's important to see that coherence kind of has within it this sort of impetus towards the truth directed, because it just wouldn't make sense if I said, well, I want my worldview to be coherent, but for me, coherence is believing all the false things. Yeah. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it just wouldn't make sense. In other words, there's assumptions involved in this. And there was actually in the Wood book, there's a really good analogy that I'll use as a kind of another bridge before we close this out. But he gives the example of an old guy who kind of lives in this estate in out in the middle of the woods, and he's this rich guy who's a recluse, and he's like a crazed conspiracy theorist, and he believes that like everything is part of a grand Cold War conspiracy. This is Dr. Wood's example. And he says that he's not interested in any new data, right? But in this vast web that he's got in his head, you can think of like the conspiracy theorist, like corkboard, where he's got the strings, right, that connect all the things on the corkboard. And it's a completely, in one sense, rational system. Right. So any new piece of data that he learns, even though he's not interested in the news because it's all part of the conspiracy, he might say, well, I discount any counter evidence because that's part of the conspiracy.
Right.
Right. So anybody who argues against my conspiracy is part of the conspiracy. So there's like this automatic kind of there's a defeater. Right. That's it's validating. What's the word I'm looking for? Where it's a non-falsifiable position. Right. Non-falsifiability. But here's the thing. It's coherent and it's logical, and in his mind, it's truth directed. So what this illustrates on one level is that coherence theory itself is not enough.
Right.
And I mean, I might even construct a worldview of 5 or 6 beliefs that are coherent that don't have anything to do with the external world. Like maybe it's just a mental ideal coherence, right? So I'm just pointing out that there are limitations in coherence theory as a secular theory that don't work for us to adopt wholesale, because like the crazed boomer Cold War conspiracy guy, anything that disagrees with him, he'll just relegate to you're part of the Marxist conspiracy and they've taken over everything. But my system is perfectly consistent. Everything makes sense. And it has look at all the explanatory power.
Right.
Look how I'm justified in every little piece of the, corkboard here.
Right.
But why would we find that to be problematic? Well, the problem is that it's a system that might be coherent, but not match up to reality. Right. So there's going to be elements left out, such as, does this actually match up to the external world? Right.
Right.
So we need more than just a secular theory of coherence. What we're looking for here is an entire paradigm or worldview that has the ability to ground not just the metaphysics, but also the epistemology and the ethics, the total worldview that can give an account for a lot of these perennial problems of philosophy, the one and the many, identity over time, the problem of induction, the existence of the self, right? What is space-time? All of these classic kinds of problems and questions in philosophy, right? Meaning, words, predication, et cetera, et cetera. And the Christian paradigm does give an account for those things, and it shows how they work, how they cohere. It has explanatory power. Now, to be clear, it doesn't answer exhaustively every possible question, but no worldview can do that.
Right.
A lot of times the opponents will bring these kinds of impossible standards. Like, well, if you can't answer every possible objection, then your worldview is not true. Well, that's no worldview can do that. Yeah. I mean, can yours? I mean, so that's, you have to, as an apologist, you have to beware, right? And be ready to call out these kinds of impossible, standards that no one can meet, which people will try to foist upon you. But the crux is just simply that the Christian paradigm has at that meta level the circularity, because if God exists and if our worldview is the case, it would necessarily be self-referential at the level of God's existence.
Right.
Because what else could God appeal to? If God appealed to something else, he wouldn't be God.
Right. And what else could created the contingency of the world appeal to, other than its necessary, the necessary being of its own origination? Right.
I mean, and I think Panos had a great point. He pointed this out, that in Exodus 3 and in the Ayer Asher Ayer, I am that I am. That's a self-referential statement.
Oh, that is a
and contrast that with the blasphemy of the autonomous system of Descartes. I think, therefore I am as a man.
Right.
What better analogy to contrast autonomous epistemology to revealed epistemology? God says I am that I am. Descartes says, no, I think, therefore I am. It's blasphemous.
Right.
And so, again, to bring it back to Descartes, there's something there that Descartes noticed about circularity at a fundamental level, right?
Yeah.
It's a bad argument, but he's hitting on this fact that, like, I can't get any more basic than some things. He didn't get really the basic thing, but what he should have said was, God says I am, therefore I am. Right. And that is a much better grounding for epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, a worldview, and a holistic approach. Again, one of those great insights from coherence theory about holism, epistemic holism.
And that we're all trapped within paradigms. We're all trapped within webs of belief. So this is when this whole foundational project falls apart in the 20th century, we have no recourse but to look now at paradigms, at a lateral level, looking at, okay, these coherency systems, the coherency of systems, and then what are their explanatory power? What is the referential basis of what are they appealing to that has to be outside their system, which you can't get outside the appeal of the creator.
Exactly. And so that's why a lot of times the opponents hear these arguments that, well, you're not actually making an argument. You're just positing your position. No, the argument is that this position gives an account for a justification for, has explanatory power, has coherence as a worldview, as a paradigm. And we're going to have to compare that to any other paradigm. And there's not an infinite number of them. There's actually a limited number of them. They might have infinite variations within the web.
Yes.
But at a fundamental center of the web level, you're actually limited in the number of worldviews that you can have.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, there's only a limited number of questions you can have about, does the universe have a beginning or is it eternal? Is there true objective propositions and knowledge, or is it all relative? Right. I mean, there's like not an infinite number of answers to that.
Right.
So, no, I don't have to refute every potential worldview. I don't have to know every worldview to refute the limited number of starting points for any worldview. And remember, pointing out starting points is not foundationalism. Having a foundational belief is not the same thing as foundationalism.
Right.
So hopefully that shed some light on circularity tonight.
Yeah. Jay, thank you so much. That I feel like
I can take super chats, and then I want to remind everybody, if I can, that if you want to come over to my Rockfin tonight, we're going to be covering some of the more recent geopolitical news and the recent Ministry of Defense transhumanist document that came out a few months ago.
Yeah, so everybody, make sure you go over to Rockfin and join Jay after this stream on some geopolitical stuff. Jay, I want to say thank you so much. This was one of the, again, we'll dive into these super chats, but we just did about an hour and 50 minutes overview of a lot of intellectual history, really laying out this circularity problem that I guarantee you this is going to help a lot of people, whether they're Orthodox or not, just lay out what the heck you've been talking about, because it goes over so many people's heads. They hear the words, they don't understand the concepts behind it, and they don't understand that the way that you're laying out this transcendental argument regarding paradigms, regarding explainability, regarding appealing to something outside the system, ultimately then appealing to God, which isn't limited by any system, that you're really on the leading edge of philosophy in the 21st century, because the entire foundationalist project has already fallen apart. And anybody arguing from that basis, go back to the 1920s. Like, what are you doing? Like, all that stuff's done.
Yeah. Yeah. And I highly recommend the Mannion paper, Contingency of Knowledge, because it's very readable. And he just does a survey of the history of philosophy and is just doing the same thing that you hear me doing. He's basically saying, look, hey, here's all these modern famous philosophers saying, epistemology is done, man. I mean, what are we going to do?
Right. So if you have any inkling that there is some type of objective truth, or that you can make truth claims, well, then any of these schools that we've already mentioned in the stream, they're dead ends. And so ultimately, then the answer is gone.
I mean, isn't the history of modern philosophy just a great testament to what Paul says, that God has made foolish the wisdom of this world?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It absolutely is. And it takes time. I think a lot of people struggle with this stuff because it takes a lot of effort to read these books, to dive into, to wade in these concepts and be able to wrap your mind around all this stuff. But once you're able to, then you come back to the simplicity of Scripture, and you can sense its profundity at a level that you without diving into all this philosophy, you don't understand how profound that statement really is by Paul.
Yes, absolutely. And, many other passages too in Scripture, reiterate that we tear down strongholds and bring every thought captive. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. The Psalm says that the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. So Scripture actually says atheism is not the height of rationalism and intellectualism. It says it's foolish. So why would we expect, to garner a bunch of good arguments from atheists and pagans and non-believers, which, they can have insights. They can have good points. Insights. But ultimately, the fool has said there's no God. So these atheistic systems are just going to end up in foolishness. And that's really the main objective of what we want to do in the transcendental argument, is point that out.
Absolutely. And if somebody then is inspired by watching you do your debates, diving into theology and having that personal relationship with Christ, but then also, diving into philosophy, and if you have any wherewithal, it's not going to take you away from God. If anything, if you go through this whole system all the way through, it's only going to bring you, there's either God or there's no God, because it's time to make an objective claim about truth, about 2 + 2 = 4, and you can't get away from this problem then. So therefore, I think it's important for people, if you're really interested in trying to defend the faith, you need to be able to steel man all the arguments that could come and attack. Having these whimsical, like sleight of hand that it's, that stuff's stupid. Well, dude, if you can't steel man it and undermine it, then you're not helping anybody come to the faith any better, because we need to be able to steel man these arguments and then undermine them based on their own systems. So
absolutely.
So first, I have my own first question before we get into super chats. What are some? And I asked you this privately, but if you could recommend a book or any books regarding one that does one stand out? I mean, I already pulled up the one on Jay Wood. I'll probably purchase that after the stream. But is there any book or books that stand out from your library that you think could benefit anybody? Whether it be about philosophy and theology, whether it be about tonight's topic, whatever, anything. Does anything stand out to you that you'd like to recommend?
That's a tough one. I mean, there's a lot of books that could be recommended. I think that if you're looking for an introduction to epistemology, again, like I said, he's an evangelical professor, but the Epistemology by W.J. Wood book is good because he at least is going to recognize and emphasize the holistic approach to the fact that our intellectual life can't be divorced from virtues. And if we divorce intellect and epistemology from virtue, then it seems to suffer from the problem of not being truth directed. And if it's not truth directed, then how are you going to prove something? How are you going to argue something, right? So it's good for showing that it's not exactly a textbook, but it's written in a really readable way. The Bonjour text that Father Deacon always recommends, it's much more like a textbook. I mean, it's very thorough, it's very long and technical, but it's still readable. It's also those are the Wood book would be better for somebody that's brand new. The Bonjour text is more of a college textbook, so it would assume some prior knowledge. I wish there was one, good, easy book to recommend about philosophy and theology per se. I mean, John Damascus's book, Fount of Knowledge, is kind of a classic, but
I bought that when you recommended it 2 years ago. Great book. It reads it reads like something that could have been written just the other day. It's very...
Yeah, I mean, that one would be good. I mean, if a person wants to go deeper into, for example, Cappadocian philosophy, Hellenic philosophy in the good sense, I would recommend the Yaroslav Pelikan book, transformation of metamorphosis of natural theology in the Cappadocians. It's a purple, big, thick book. It's not an easy read, but it would be a good introduction to the importance of how the Cappadocians use philosophy. And the reason that's so important for us is that, I mean, those are the guys that really settle and end the Trinity debate. So, of course, everybody knows Athanasius is crucial at Nicaea for the Trinity, but the next council also pretty much ends Trinitarian debates for the next millennia. There's no more Trinitarian debates until the medieval Palamite synods. And so I would say that it's really helpful to understand the metaphysics of the Cappadocians, because I don't believe that those are just schools of thought. I actually think we're kind of, as Orthodox, we're kind of bound to the metaphysics of the 7 ecumenical councils, and the 7 councils flow from the metaphysic that's ratified and accepted at primarily Constantinople I through the Cappadocians. So the Cappadocians are really crucial for Orthodox Christianity. And modern thinkers or theologians, Father Staniloy's Orthodox Dogmatics, Volume 1, which is about Orthodox epistemology, a revealed Orthodox epistemology. That's a classic. That one's really good. So those are the ones that come to mind right now. And of course, Dr. Bradshaw's Aristotle East and West is a necessary read, especially for Catholics or Thomists. Right. But that one is a very difficult book. And
this
so
one is very academic. So are these, but
yeah, those I would say the Aristotle East and West book would require, a significant amount of philosophical knowledge. So you might want to start with some of those others before going to those heavier ones.
All right. First super chat comes from Orthodox Chloroquine and says, "Love it when you two get together and talk about the most scintillating of subjects. God bless." Well, thank you so much, Orthodoxy Chloroquine. Really appreciate it, brother. Next super chat comes from our good friend Made by Jim Bob, and he says, "Can either of you summarize if Lawrence Bonjour had any legit points in defense of pure reason?" So I haven't read that book. What is your? Could you respond to Jim Bob?
I'll be honest, I don't remember. I mean, does he defend Kant's pure reason, you're saying, or is it like he has like a conception of pure reason that he defends? Still here,
maybe you can say.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't remember off the top of my head. So I bought this in 2019 when Father Deacon recommended it to me, and I don't remember what his argument was about that, honestly.
Yeah.
Like I was telling David, Patrick, Harry before we started, so I had my epistemology class. I was looking at I dug out my college notes because I kept all my college papers and notes.
Good.
My epistemology class was 2005. So when I started talking to Father Deacon a couple of years ago, I got him to recommend me some more recent epistemology texts, because what's 2005? That's 17 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and before this stream, I went and, reread 2 or 3 chapters and brushed up on some of this, because, I mean, I'm not, my focus of study was not epistemology. I like epistemology. I find it fascinating, but it's not the main area. My main areas were the Greeks, metaphysics, Plato, Aristotle, medieval stuff. And so even though I really like a lot of the modern epistemology debates and questions, it wasn't my main area of philosophy study, but I'm happy to always, learn more about it. Well, Father Deacon is he knows, that's his area. So he knows it a lot better than me.
Yeah. So Jim Bob, feel free to reach out to Norwegian News, Father Deacon, Dr. Ananias, and he can tell you. I'm going to purchase that Bonjour book and the Jay Wood book when I get off this stream. So I appreciate for both of those recommendations. Next super chat comes from Frankie D and says, "My 2 favorite streamers doing a crossover. This is awesome. Love you guys. Someone told me I shouldn't resist the stabbies because I wasn't a scientist. What is the proper philosophical argument against this?"
Sounds like it would be a version of the no true Scotsman fallacy. Yeah. So only a true scientist can know or knows what is, should be done in this or that case. And that seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
And by the way, who's the true scientist, brother? If the scientists disagree, then who's the true scientist? Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't even know how even the question is philosophical. So yeah. So I would respond by, you can make your own health choices. That the appeal to any type of authority makes no sense when multiple authorities of the same class category disagree. So next super chat comes from, so thank you, Frankie D. Really appreciate that. Next super chat comes from Nathaniel Hill. Shout out to Nathaniel Hill and his family. Throws in 5432 and says, epic stream, guys. We'll definitely be rewatching this one and taking notes and a reading list. So excellent. Well, thank you very much, Nathaniel Hill. Again, shout out to your family and your new baby boy. Hope all is well. Next super chat comes from Rich. And he says, do either of you know what happened to Luke's Orthodoxy First channel? Videos are all gone. Luke took all that stuff down, Rich. And so he's in seminary. And so I think all that stuff's either privated or deleted. So it's been like that since he left. Next super chat comes from Stevie and says, hey guys, I scheduled my chrismation with my priest. Wouldn't have happened without you mean people. Thanks. Well, that's excellent, Stevie. Congratulations. Next super chat comes from Jethro, somebody I'm sure we're both familiar with, and he says, JD with the Johnny Cash vibes tonight. Can he do a line of Pumpkin Possum and sing Ring of Fire for us?
I fell into a burning ring of fire. Is that a pretty good Johnny Cash?
Thank you so much, Jethro. Really appreciate it. God bless you, brother. And Pim Orosov. Sorry, I'm totally butchering your last name. He says, I like your axiom that truth is a who, not a what. So he spells axiom with a U. And then Pim says, although I think it's more accurate to say the logos is all the questions, the who, the what, the when, the why, to us has whose, our deepest understanding is the who. Well, Pim, I appreciate the super chat. I'm having a little bit of trouble following the message here. So I get the axiom, truth is a who, not a what. Yeah, we're talking about personhood theology. Although I think it's more accurate to say the logos is all the questions, the who, the what, the when, the why. To us, has whose, our deepest understanding is the who. You lost me on the last part there, Pim. I apologize. Could just be lost in translation here, but I think you're getting at the personhood theology, and I really appreciate your support, and glad that the truth is a who, not a what, has proved beneficial. Regarding the logos being all the questions, I guess the where would be a difficult one to answer, but anyways, Pim, thank you very much for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Next super chat comes from Frankie D and says, I was thinking about how certain beliefs about the world, especially pushed by the state, create these unnatural situations and relationships between people. And all of these different programs are created to address those problems rather than the root. Yeah, I would agree to some degree. Jay, do you have any response to that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would agree.
Yeah,
as far as I understand.
So thank you very much, Frankie D, for the super chat, brother. God bless you. Thanks for all the support. Johnsonville throws in $7 and says, which is more sincere, Putin's orthodoxy or his being an acolyte of Klaus?
I don't know. I don't know his intentions personally. I mean, I don't rest my orthodoxy on any world leader any more than I rest my existence as American on Trump or Bo Biden, right? I mean, yeah. I don't have any knowledge of that.
I would echo that similar sentiment. I don't know what's in Putin's heart. I can't decipher his intentions. Obviously, there's a lot of different things that would cause one to have suspicion. Acolyte of Klaus, I mean, plenty of those. I mean, from my understanding, the new governor, Youngkin, he was part of the World Economic Forum over in Virginia. I know Peterson's been over at the World Economic Forum. I know the World Economic Forum's young leaders is like Crenshaw and a bunch of different people in contemporary politics. So I don't know. Who knows anybody's intentions, but definitely it'd be a purpose for you to grow in your knowledge, your understanding, and your faith regarding orthodoxy, regardless of what Putin or Krill or whoever, any patriarch or whoever does. Doesn't matter. So anyways, thank you very much, Johnsonville, for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Rich throws in another super chat and says, Best ortho chads on YouTube. Thanks for what you guys do. Thank you very much, Rich. Really appreciate the compliment, and thanks for enjoying the content. Next super chat comes from Jared Fetzer, $3, says, does believing in the evolutionary model necessarily marry you to the evidentialist point of view when taken to its logical end? Oh, here we go. We actually have a real question. So does believing in the evolutionary model, so Jay, you can take this wherever you want. I would say, first, when you say evolutionary model, you have to decipher, are you talking about natural selection or are you talking about macroevolution? Those are two different things that people confuse within the quote-unquote evolutionary model.
I suppose there could be, theoretically, there could be a person who, for example, holds to evolutionary theory but is a coherence theorist and doesn't believe in some kind of evidentialism. I'm not aware of people that have that position, but I mean, in academia, there's people that take all kinds of positions. So, yeah, I mean, beyond that, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, part of that falling apart of the foundationalist project was to try to move epistemology over to biology, and that the article that you highlighted kind of emphasized that point. But I mean, it's going to be unlikely, because if you're going to move forward in an evolutionary model, you're going to be dealing with phenomenal activity in the world. And by definition, you're going to be looking for more for an evidentialist, foundationalist approach.
I mean, I could think of somebody who would so Berkeley might be a unique case, but I don't know how many people hold to George Berkeley's philosophy. Like maybe one professor in a million would defend that kind of weird view, but Berkeley is a unique case because he's a idealist empiricist, and I suppose that somebody could be an idealist empiricist and at least claim to hold to evolution, but I think all that would kind of be just silly positions, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Yeah, I didn't even think about Berkeley. So thank you very much, Jared. I really appreciate that super chat. Next one comes from Levigid Madikid, the fifth, I guess. I want to join the Orthodox Church and have been to a couple of liturgies, including today, but the priest doesn't seem to care. So do you have any advice for our Orthodox inquirer, Jay?
I've experienced things like that. And I mean, sometimes it might be that the orthodoxy is not like the evangelical world, where they're going to try to coax you through, different ways to make sure that you convert. So sometimes Orthodox priests or people can seem kind of kept to themselves or standoffish because we aren't quick to convert. Right. In fact, the process is very long. Most of the time, it's 1 to 3 years of people coming into the church, and that's because it's taken very seriously. So it's not like joining the Baptist church where you walk down the aisle and you join that day. It's very different. Maybe you're at a very ethnically homogenous parish, and maybe they don't speak English very well. That could be I mean, there's a lot of different variables as to why that might be. Maybe it is a bad priest, and so maybe you want to check all the other Orthodox churches around you because maybe there's a better fit. But I've had situations like that, and I would say don't let one seemingly bad experience sour you, I would just check out. What I did eventually was literally go to all of the Orthodox churches within the vicinity of where I lived, and I found the one that was God's providence, the best fit for me. And it actually happened to be the very last one. like I was like getting kind of frustrated because I'd gone to 4 different ones, and I was like, none of these really seem, like a place I want to keep going back to, honestly. But then the last one that I went to ended up being one I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Similar journey. That the first few that I went to, not as welcoming, and then I found one that was very welcoming, and it turned out to be the less aesthetic, the smallest, but very good priest. Love the priest, and so you got to go experience. You got to jump in the water and figure out what one fits you the best. So good luck with your inquiry, brother. God bless you in your journey, and I hope that you definitely find the right church that fits for you. So God bless. Next super chat comes from the Orthodox Logos, throws in $5 and says, "My brother, God bless you and Jay." Well, thank you so much, the Orthodox Logos. Shout out to you and your family. Hope you guys are doing well. Next super chat comes from Chase Mudd. Says, "I just wanted to say good work today, gentlemen. Also, the Bible believers are mad at you, Jay. I need to catch up on your recent open debate to find out why."
He may be referring to the James White critique stream.
Oh, okay. That very well. I'm sure that brings that probably.
Oh, there was a guy. Yeah. So after I critiqued James White for the first hour and a half, then there was a Protestant dude who, it was basically a repeat of the Father Deacon and Matt Slick debate, where the Protestant argument was basically just, well, I know what the canon of Scripture is because I believe the Bible. So,
talking about circularity,
I don't think so I listened again to that debate, or re-listened to it, and I don't think, and I'm not trying to be mean to that guy, I don't think he actually understood what the canon was. Like, he thought by saying canon of Scripture that I just meant the Bible, and I was actually talking about the decision to what books go in the Bible.
Right.
And he kept just sort of confusing, thinking that those are the same things.
Well, Chase, I think
so. That's probably why the Bible people are mad. I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, that probably is what. Well, thank you, Chase Mudd, for the $1 super chat. Really appreciate it. Rolfling Steaks, ROFLING Steaks, throws in $9.99 and says, "Thanks, guys, for doing this stream. Just want to let everyone know YouTube just removed the Holy Father Tryphon posted today. Removed the homily, that Father Tryphon posted today for talking about the immunization, you will say, in the current authoritative state." Wow, I did not know that. So, well, God bless Abbot Tryphon, and at least for standing up, speaking truth in a time in which it is most certainly persecuted. So God bless him, and I'll try to see if I can get a copy of that homily. And then last super chat, very generous super chat, comes from Golden Arm 2007 and says, throws in $75 and says, "No question, carry on." So thank you so much, Golden Arm, for the generous super chat. And that looks like that does it. So I just want to say, Jay, I want to get you out of here because I know you got another stream. Again, I don't know where you find the energy, man. It's crazy how much content you put out.
Yeah, so if you're on Rockfin, come over in the next 30 minutes over about 9 o'clock Central, and I'll be doing a live stream on geopolitics and the transhumanist document.
Excellent. Well, Jay, thanks again for coming on. God bless you and Jamie, and really look forward to the next one. Anything you want to say before hopping off?
No, you can subscribe to my stuff over at Jay's Analysis, my YouTube channel. I think everybody has probably seen it there, but sure. Also, my sponsor is chalk.com. They're a great base company. They're pro-masculinity. I recommend their supplements. You can get 50% off over at chalk.com. That's CHOQ, and it's J50 gets you 50% off of their T-boosting and mental clarity having supplements.
All right, we'll do it. Make sure to use his promo and go over to Chalk. go subscribe to Jay, and make sure you follow him over on the Rockfin for his geopolitical discussion tonight in about 30. So thanks again, Jay. God bless you. And I will see everybody in the next one.